chest, crying out to the sky, "Sam! Sam! Why have you left us?" The men stood in solemn clusters, shaking their heads, their faces arranged in masks of appropriate sorrow. My mother walked past them all, her hand gripping mine, her face a stone. She did not wail. She did not fall. She simply walked, leading her children to the place where her husband would be laid to rest. The trouble began almost immediately. It was my father's eldest brother, Uncle Osazi, who first showed his hand. He was a tall man with a permanent stoop and eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. He had been the first beneficiary of my father's generosity, his children's school fees paid for years, his wife's business started with a loan that was never mentioned again. He stood at the entrance to the family parlor where the casket would be received, his arms folded across his chest. "There will be no lying in state here," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. My mother stopped walking. She turned to face him slowly, and I felt her hand tighten around mine. "What did you say?" "The women cannot receive the body. It is not our custom for a widow to receive her husband in the family home. She must wait outside until the elders have prepared everything." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. We had been to funerals in Irua before. I had seen widows receive their husbands, had seen them collapse across the casket, had seen the family gather around to support them. But Uncle Osazi stood there, backed by a cluster of other uncles, their faces hard and unyielding. Auntie Adesua stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Osase, what kind of nonsense is this? Sam was her husband. These are his children. They have every right to receive him." "Adesua, you are a woman married into another family. You have no say here." Uncle Osazi's voice was cold, dismissive. "This is Osegbovo family matter. The widow will wait." My mother said nothing. She simply released my hand and stepped back, pulling my sisters with her, retreating to the edge of the courtyard where the other women stood. I watched her go, and something inside me hardened into a knot of rage that would take years to untangle. They brought my father's casket into the house without us. We stood outside in the hot sun and listened to the sound of men moving furniture, arranging chairs, preparing to receive visitors who would come to pay their respects. We were his wife, his children, and we were locked out of his home. The days that followed were a study in humiliation. The burial was set for Saturday, but the week leading up to it was filled with 1,000 small cruelties, each one designed to remind us that we were outsiders now, that without my father, we had no place in this family. My mother was given a small room at the back of the compound, a windowless cell that had once been used for storage. It had a single bed, a mat on the floor for my sisters and me, and nothing else. When Auntie Adesua protested, she was told that the main rooms were for important family members, the uncles and their wives who had come from far away. "Important family members," my mother repeated that night, her voice flat. "Your father fed those important family members for 20 years. He paid for their children to go to school, he settled their debts, he buried their dead, and now we are not important." The food situation was worse. Each meal was a negotiation. We would sit in the courtyard with the other mourners, and plates would be distributed, generous portions for the uncles, for the elders, for the visitors from Lagos and Wari. But when it came to us, there was always a delay, a hesitation, a muttered excuse about limited supplies. More than once we went hungry while the uncles' wives picked at plates of rice and meat. On Wednesday, the accusations began. It was Uncle Tony, the youngest of my father's brothers, who started it. He was a loud man, given to dramatic gestures and sudden shifts in mood. My father had paid for his apprenticeship 8 years ago, had bought him the tools to start his welding business, had bailed him out when the business failed. Now he stood in the center of the courtyard, his voice carrying to every corner of the compound. "This death is not ordinary," he announced, and the chatter around him fell silent. "A man does not just die at 49. A man does not leave his family without warning. There is something behind this." He looked directly at my mother. My mother, who had been sitting quietly with my youngest sister on her lap, went very still. I saw Auntie Adesua rise to her feet, but my mother put out a hand to stop her. "I am saying," Uncle Tony continued, emboldened by the silence, "that we must ask questions. We must look at who was with him, who was closest to him, who had the most to gain." The implication hung in the air like poison. My mother, who had loved my father with a patience that bordered on sainthood, who had waited 20 years for a flat in Surulere while he gave everything to them, my mother was being accused of his murder. "Tony, sit down." It was Uncle Osaze, but his voice carried no real rebuke. It was a performance designed to show that he was above such things while leaving the accusation hanging. Other voices joined in. A woman I didn't know, some distant cousin from a village beyond Irua, spoke of how my mother had always looked tired, always seemed frustrated with my father's generosity. Another mentioned that she had been distant since his death, not weeping enough, not performing grief in the proper way. Weeping enough, Auntie Adazua spat, finally unable to contain herself. You want her to weep? You want her to tear her clothes and roll in the dust? She has lost her husband. She has lost her life. And you sit here eating food paid for by the man you now accuse her of killing? And you talk about proper grief? Uncle Osei stood then, his face dark. Adesua, you will be silent. You are married, you are no longer Osai Bovo. You have no standing here. I am Sam's sister, Auntie Adesua said, her voice trembling with rage. I am the one who watched him carry this family on his back for 30 years. I am the one who saw him miss his children's sports days to settle your disputes. I am the one who knows that every kobo he ever made went to one of you. And now you stand here in his father's compound and you accuse his wife? Shame on you. Shame on all of you. She walked to my mother and sat beside her, taking her hand. I am standing with her, she said loudly for everyone to hear. If she has no standing here, then neither do I. We will sit together and we will bury my brother, and then we will leave this place and never return. And when you need someone to pay for your next funeral, when your children cannot go to school, when your wives are sick and you have no money for hospital, do not look for us. Do not look for Sam's children. You have shown us who you are. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. The uncles shifted in their seats, avoiding each other's eyes. The women looked at the ground, and my mother, who had not spoken a word through all of it, finally lifted her head and looked at each of them in turn. I did not kill my husband, she said quietly. I loved him. I loved him more than my own life, and I will spend the rest of my days missing him. But you, her voice cracked, but she continued, you killed him. Slowly. Every time you called, every time you needed, every time you took and never gave. You killed him with your need, and now you want to blame me. God will judge you. She stood, gathered my sisters, and walked away. Auntie Adesua followed, and I followed too, my heart pounding with a rage I didn't know I possessed. Behind us, the compound buzzed with whispered conversations, with arguments, with the first stirrings of shame that would never quite take root. The burial itself was a nightmare. We were seated at the back, behind the important relatives, behind the chiefs and elders who had come to pay their respects. My father's casket, a simple wooden box draped in white, sat at the front of the church. The pastor spoke of a good man, a generous man, a man who had given his life for others. I sat in the pew and thought about how true that was, how literally true. After the service, we processed to the cemetery. The uncles carried the casket, their faces solemn, their steps measured. My mother walked behind, supported by Auntie Adesua and my sisters. I walked beside her, watching the backs of the men who had destroyed my father and were now performing their grief for the cameras. At the graveside, Uncle Osaz gave a speech. He spoke of my father's love for his family, his dedication to his brothers, his willingness to sacrifice. He did not mention my mother. He did not mention us. It was as if we did not exist, as if the 25 years of marriage had produced nothing, as if the 3 children standing in the hot sun were strangers. When it was time to throw dirt on the casket, the uncles went first. They each took a handful of red earth and dropped it onto the wood, their faces arranged in expressions of appropriate sorrow. Then the elders, then the important visitors. By the time it was my mother's turn, the grave was nearly full. She knelt in the dust, took a handful of earth, and held it for a long moment. Rest, Sam, she whispered. Rest. You don't have to carry them anymore. She dropped the earth, and it landed with a soft thud on the wood. Then she stood, turned, and walked away without looking back. That night, the family met to discuss the estate. There was no estate. There was a small house in Benin, rented, not owned. There was a car, a decade-old Peugeot 504 that my father had used to drive to work. There were some clothes, some books, some photographs. That was all. My father had given everything else away. But the uncles did not believe this. They sat in the family parlor, their faces hard, their voices accusing. They spoke of money my father must have hidden, of accounts we were keeping secret, of property that rightfully belonged to the family. We are not leaving here until we see the accounts, Uncle Osei announced. Sam was our brother. His property belongs to all of us. My mother sat before them, a small woman in a black wrapper, her face lined with exhaustion. There are no accounts, she said. There is nothing. He gave it all to you. Ask yourselves where the money went. They did not ask themselves. They did not want to know. They wanted to believe that there was something left, something they could still take, something that would make this journey worthwhile. Auntie Adesua stood with us, as she had stood through everything. She argued, she shouted, she threatened to call the police. But the uncles were unmoved. They searched the small room where we were staying. They went through my father's bags. They even opened the casket, looking for money hidden in the burial clothes. They found nothing. Of course, they found nothing. My father had died as he had lived, empty-handed, his wealth scattered across the lives of people who would not even let his wife mourn in peace. We left Irua the next morning. Auntie Adesua drove, my mother silent in the passenger seat, my sisters and I cramped in the back with what remained of our belongings. As the compound receded in the rearview mirror, I watched it until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon. "Don't look back," Auntie Adesua said, her eyes on the road. "Don't ever look back. Those people are not your family. Your family is in this car. Your family is your mother, your sisters, and me. The rest of them can burn." My mother said nothing. She had not spoken since the graveside. She sat with her face turned toward the window, watching the red earth of Irua give way to the paved roads of Benin, and I did not know if she was grieving or relieved or simply empty. I looked back anyway. I looked back because I needed to remember. I needed to remember the faces of the men who had eaten my father's food, who had worn his clothes, who had sent their children to school with his money, and who had then stood over his grave and accused his wife of murder. I needed to remember so that when they came, when the need inevitably arose again, I would know what to say. The answer was nothing. The answer was the closed door. The answer was the silence they had taught us. My father had spent his life ensuring his family would never become a laughingstock. He had carried them on his back, fed them from his table, sheltered them under his roof. And in the end, they had laughed anyway. They had laughed at his funeral. They had laughed at his widow. They had laughed at his children. The joke, it turned out, was on him, on us, on everyone who believed that sacrifice would be rewarded, that goodness would be remembered, that family meant something more than blood. We drove away from Irua, and behind us the dust settled over my father's grave, and over the family he had died for. They would go on, those uncles and aunts and cousins. They would find new victims, new sources of generosity, new people to drain, but they would never find another Samo Segbovo. They would never find another man willing to die so they could live. And somewhere in that knowledge, cold and hard as iron, I found the first stirrings of something that would carry me through the years ahead. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just the simple, brutal truth that my father had been wrong. Family was not a rope that tied you. It was a choice, and I would choose differently. After Irua, we returned to Benin City like refugees returning to a ruined village. The bungalow on Ogiso Street, once a home filled with my father's quiet presence, was now just a house. Empty rooms echoing with memories, a bed where he would never sleep again, a chair by the window where he had sat with his Golder beer, staring at the darkening street. The first thing my mother did was pack away his things. His clothes, his shoes, his small collection of books, the black diary where he had recorded every loan, every school fee paid, every debt settled in the name of family. She folded everything carefully, placed them in an old trunk, and pushed the trunk to the back of her wardrobe. She did not cry. She had not cried since the funeral, and I was beginning to understand that her tears had been replaced by something harder, something that would carry her through the years ahead, but would also leave her forever changed. "We need to talk," she said on the evening of our return. My sisters, Eve and Osa, sat on the sofa, their faces young and frightened. I sat across from them, trying to look older than my 14 years. My mother stood by the window, her back to us, her voice carefully controlled. "Your father left us nothing. You know this. The money that came in went out to family. The house we live in is rented. The car is old and may not last much longer. There is no savings, no investments, nothing." She paused, and I saw her shoulders tighten. "I have been a housewife for 25 years. I have no skills, no trade, no way to make money. What I have is this house until the end of the year, when the rent expires, and after that I don't know." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I had ever felt. Eve, who was 12, began to cry quietly. Osa's, only 9, crawled into my lap and buried her face in my chest. I held her and stared at my mother's back and tried to comprehend a future that had suddenly become invisible. "I will find work," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I can leave school, get a job, support us." My mother turned then, and her face was fierce. "No, absolutely not. Your father sacrificed everything so you could have an education. You will finish school, you will go to university, you will become something. That is non-negotiable." "Then how—" "I don't know yet," her voice softened, "but I will find a way. I am still your mother. I will find a way." The way, it turned out, was degradation. My mother, who had never worked a day in her life, who had been married at 18 and sheltered ever since, began selling fried plantains by the roadside. She would wake at 4 a.m. before the first prayers sounded from the nearby mosque and walk to the market to buy plantains. She would return, slice them carefully, fry them in palm oil, and pack them into small plastic bags. Then she would sit on a low stool at the junction near our house from morning until night, calling out to passers-by, "Boli, boli, fresh boli." I would see her sometimes on my way home from school. She would be sitting there in the heat, the smoke from her small charcoal grill rising around her, her face shiny with sweat, her hands black with oil. She would wave when she saw me and smile, and I would smile back, and we would both pretend that this was normal, that this was what we had always done, that our lives had not collapsed into dust. But at night I would hear her crying. Not the loud wailing of the funeral, but soft, muffled sobs that she tried to hide beneath her pillow. She cried for my father, I think, but also for herself, for the life she had lost, for the dreams of Surulair that had died with him. She cried because she was tired, because her feet hurt, because the plantains didn't always sell, because some days we went to bed with nothing but water in our stomachs. I wanted to help her. I wanted to leave school, to find work, to lift even a small portion of the weight from her shoulders. But she had made her position clear, and my father's voice echoed in her commands. Education was the only way out, the only path that did not lead to a roadside grill and smoke-stained clothes. So I studied. I studied like my life depended on it because I was beginning to understand that it did. I stayed up late into the night, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp while my mother and sister slept. I memorized equations, historical dates, chemical formulas. I filled exercise books with notes until my fingers cramped. And every morning I walked past my mother at her roadside stall, and I saw in her eyes a hope that I was determined not to disappoint. The extended family, of course, was nowhere to be found. In the first weeks after my father's death, a few of them called. Uncle Osazi phoned once to ask if we had found the estate money yet. When my mother told him again that there was nothing, he hung up and never called back. Uncle Tony, who had accused my mother of murder, sent word through a cousin that he was praying for us, but the prayers did not include food or school fees or rent money. The cousins whose education my father had paid for, whose businesses he had funded, whose lives he had built, they disappeared like morning mist. Only Auntie Adesua remained. She came from Lagos whenever she could, bringing bags of rice and beans, secondhand clothes for my sisters, money pressed into my mother's hand when she thought no one was looking. She was the one who paid my school fees for the first 2 years after my father died, who bought my mother a proper frying pan when the old one wore out, who sat with us at Christmas and made sure we had something to eat. "Your father's family are dogs," she said once, blunt as always. Dogs who ate from his hand and then bit him when he was gone. But you children are not dogs. You are Osagbovo, and you are also Eki's children, and that means you have strength. You will survive, you will thrive, and one day they will come back begging, and you will remember this. I remembered everything. By the time I was 16, I had become the man of the house in ways that went beyond title. I found work on weekends and during school holidays, anything I could get. I swept floors at a provision store on Akpakpava Street. I carried loads for traders at New Benin Market. I washed cars at a mechanic workshop, my hands perpetually stained with grease. The money was small, pitiful really, but it bought kerosene for the lamp, salt for the soup, sometimes meat on Sundays. My mother continued to sell plantains, but her health was failing. The years of stress, of poor food, of sitting in the sun and rain had taken their toll. Her knees ached constantly. Her hands trembled. She developed a cough that never quite went away, but she refused to stop. "As long as I can sit," she would say, "I can sell. As long as I can sell, we can eat." Ife, my younger sister, dropped out of school in SS2. It was her decision, made quietly, without drama. She came home one day and announced that she had found work as a shop assistant in a boutique on Mission Road. My mother wept, begged, pleaded, but Eve was stubborn as my father had been, as stubborn as my mother was becoming. "Mama, you cannot do this alone," she said, holding our mother's hands, "and Osis is still small. She needs to finish school. I will work. I will help. When Osis is done, maybe I can go back. But for now, this is how it has to be." I watched my sister sacrifice her future, and something inside me hardened further. I studied even harder. I took my WAEC exams and passed with distinctions in every subject. I gained admission to the University of Benin to study accounting, just as my father had always wanted. And every month, Eve's salary from the boutique paid for my textbooks, my transport, my upkeep. We were a family of women holding up a world, and I was determined to be worthy of their sacrifice. University was its own kind of struggle. The other students seemed to come from another planet. They had new clothes, new phones, pocket money for snacks and movies. They complained about their allowances being too small, about their parents not understanding them, about the pressure to get good grades. I sat among them in silence, my uniform trousers patched at the knees, my single pair of shoes resoled so many times they had lost their original shape, my stomach often empty. I ate once a day, sometimes twice if Eve had sent money. I walked everywhere to save transport fare. I studied in the library because the kerosene for our lamp at home was too expensive to waste. I made no friends, attended no parties, joined no societies. I was a ghost on that campus, present only in the classrooms and the library, invisible everywhere else. But I excelled. I excelled because failure was not an option. Failure meant my mother's plantains had been fried for nothing. Failure meant Eve's sacrifice was wasted. Failure meant Osas would end up on the street selling something, anything, just to survive. I could not fail. I would not fail. In my second year, I nearly did. It was the middle of a semester, and the money had simply stopped. Eve's boutique had closed. The owner had fled to Abua with everyone's salaries. My mother was sick, too sick to sit at her roadside stall. Osas was still in secondary school, her fees overdue, the teachers threatening to send her home, and I had no food, no transport, no way to buy the textbooks I needed for my exams. For 3 days, I ate nothing. On the 4th day, I collapsed in the library. A security guard found me, called an ambulance, and I woke up in the University Health Center with a drip in my arm and a doctor's stern face looking down at me. Malnutrition, he said, severe. You're lucky you collapsed here and not on the road. You could have died. I said nothing. What was there to say? That I had no money for food? That my father's family had abandoned us? That my mother was dying by inches on a roadside in Benin City? The doctor gave me a lecture about taking care of myself, discharged me with a packet of vitamins, and sent me back to my empty world. That night, I sat in my room and wept. I wept for the first time since my father's funeral, great heaving sobs that shook my whole body. I wept because I was tired, because I was hungry, because I was 16 years old and carrying the weight of a family on shoulders that were still growing. I wept because my father had died for people who did not care, because my mother was killing herself for us, because my sister had given up her future for mine. I wept until there were no tears left, and then I sat in the darkness and made a decision. I would not break, I would bend, I would suffer, I would endure, but I would not break. And one day I would be so successful that none of this would matter. One day I would lift my mother and my sisters out of this poverty forever. One day the family that had abandoned us would come crawling back, and I would have the pleasure of turning them away. It was not a noble thought. It was not what my father would have wanted, but my father was dead and I was alive, and the living had to make their own choices. I finished my degree in 3 years instead of 4, taking extra courses, attending summer sessions, never stopping. I graduated with a first-class honors in accounting, the best in my department. At the graduation ceremony, my mother sat in the front row, her body thin and frail, her face radiant with pride. Eve sat beside her, smiling through tears. Osas, now in her final year of secondary school, waved frantically whenever I looked in their direction. They had done this. They had made this possible. And as I walked across that stage to receive my degree, I knew that my real work was just beginning. The job offers came quickly. With a first class from Uniben, I was a prize catch. I chose a job with an oil company in Lagos, the same city my mother had dreamed of, the same Surulere that had slipped through our fingers so many years before. The salary was good, the benefits were better. For the first time in 6 years, I could breathe. My first month's salary, I sent half to my mother. She called me crying, telling me to keep it, to save for my future. But I knew the truth. She had stopped selling plantains months ago, her body finally giving out. She was living on whatever Eve could send from her new job at a cleaning company, and it wasn't enough. I sent the money anyway, and I kept sending it every month without fail. Within 2 years, I had saved enough to move my mother and sisters to Lagos, not to Surulere. That dream was still too expensive, but to a decent flat in Ikeja, with running water and electricity and a kitchen that actually worked. My mother stood in that kitchen on the first day, running her hands over the gas cooker, and wept. "Your father would have been so proud," she whispered, "so proud." I said nothing. I was thinking of my father, of his open hand, of the family that had bled him dry. I was thinking of Uncle Osais and Uncle Tony and all the cousins who had disappeared. I was thinking of the lessons I had learned in those long, hungry years. Lessons about who to trust, who to help, who to hold at arm's length. The first one to come was Uncle Oseiz. He found me at my office in Victoria Island, somehow talked his way past security, appeared at my desk like a ghost from a past I had tried to bury. He was older now, thinner, his clothes frayed at the edges. The confident man who had barred my mother from my father's lying in state was gone, replaced by someone smaller, diminished. "Son," he said, and the word was like acid on my skin. "Son, I have been looking for you." I did not stand. I did not offer my hand. I looked at him. This man who had accused my mother of murder, who had searched my father's casket for money, who had watched us leave Irua with nothing and never once reached out. I looked at him, and I felt nothing. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice flat. "Your Auntie Adesua. I begged her. She told me where you work." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the office. "Things are hard, son. Very hard. Your Uncle Tony is sick. Cancer. The family has spent everything on his treatment. We need help. We thought, with your good job, maybe you could—" "No." The word hung in the air between us. Uncle Oseizi blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "No," he repeated. "No," I said again. I stood up then, finally, and looked down at him. "You came to my father's funeral and accused my mother of killing him. You locked us out of his home. You searched his casket for money. You left us with nothing, to starve, to struggle, to suffer. My sister dropped out of school because we couldn't afford fees. My mother sold plantains by the roadside until her body gave out. I ate once a day for 4 years. I collapsed in a library from malnutrition. And through all of that, where were you? Where was the family?" Uncle Oseizi's face crumpled. "We didn't know." "You knew." My voice was cold, colder than I'd ever heard it. "You knew and you didn't care. My father spent his entire life carrying this family. He paid for your children's school fees. He funded your businesses. He settled your debts. And when he died, you showed us exactly what you thought of him and of us. Now you come here begging and you expect me to be like him, to open my hand and give until I have nothing left?" I walked to the door of my office and held it open. "Get out." Uncle Oseiz stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. For a moment I saw something in his eyes, shame, perhaps, or the first flicker of understanding. Then it was gone, replaced by the same hard calculation I had seen at the funeral, the same assessment of what he could still get from this encounter. "Your father would be ashamed of you," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Turning away your own blood. He spent his life making sure this family never became a laughingstock, and you— My father is dead." I cut him off, my voice rising for the first time. "He died because of you, because of all of you. He died carrying a weight that should have been shared, and I will not make the same mistake. I will help my mother, I will help my sisters, I will help Auntie Adesua, who stood with us when no one else would. But you and the rest of them, you can rot." Uncle Oseizi left. He walked past me without another word, and I watched him go, and I felt nothing but a cold, clean satisfaction. That night I called my mother and told her what had happened. She was silent for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "Your father would not have done that." "I know," I said, "but I am not my father." "No," she agreed, "you are not. You are stronger, harder. You had to be." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "But don't let them make you cruel, my son. Don't let them turn you into something you're not. Help who you can when you can, but help wisely. That is the lesson your father never learned. Help wisely." I thought about her words for a long time after we hung up. I thought about my father, about his open hand, about the family that had drained him dry. I thought about Uncle Oseiz, about the look on his face as he left my office. I thought about my mother, about Ife, about Osas, about all the years of hunger and struggle and silent endurance. I would help wisely. I would help those who deserved it, those who had earned it, those who would not take my help and then disappear until the next crisis. I would be generous, but I would not be a fool. I would carry my family, my real family, but I would not carry the world. And somewhere in Irua, my father's bones turned to dust in the red earth, and the family he had died for continued to rot from the inside out. They would come for me again, I knew. They would come when the money ran out, when the sickness struck, when the roof leaked and the children needed fees. They would come, and I would be ready. I would be ready to say no.